Exodus chapter 32. And again, I'm not going to read all this. We'll just read the first 28 verses, and I encourage you to read the rest. But it says this, and I'm reading from New Living Translation. It's on the screen behind me as well. When Moses failed to come back down the mountain right away, the people went to Aaron and said, "Look, make us some gods who can lead us. This man Moses who brought us here from Egypt has disappeared. We don't know what has happened to him." So Aaron said, "Tell your wives and sons and daughters to take off their gold earrings and bring them to me." And all the people obeyed Aaron and brought him the gold earrings. And then Aaron took the gold, he melted it down and molded it and tooled it into the shape of a calf. And the people exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought you up out of Egypt." And when Aaron saw how excited the people were about it, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." And so the people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. And after this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking and indulged themselves in pagan revelry. Then the Lord told Moses, "Quick, go down the mountain. The people you brought from Egypt have defiled themselves. They have already turned away from me and the way I commanded them to live. And they have made an idol shaped like a calf, and they have worshipped and sacrificed to it. They are saying, 'These are the gods who, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt.'" And then the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen how stubborn, how stiff-necked and rebellious these people are. Now leave me alone so my anger can blaze against them and destroy them all. And then I will make you, Moses, into a great nation instead of them." But Moses pleaded with the Lord, his God, not to do it. "O Lord," he exclaimed, "why are you so angry with your own people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with such great power and mighty acts? The Egyptians will say, 'God tricked them into coming to the mountain so we could kill them and wipe them from the face of the earth.' Turn away from your fierce anger. Change your mind about this terrible disaster you're planning to bring against your people. Remember your covenant promise to your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You swore by your own self, 'I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven. Yes, I will give them all of the land I promised to your descendants, and they will possess it forever.' So the Lord withdrew his threat, and he didn't bring against the people the disaster he had threatened. Then Moses turned and went down the mountain, and he held in his hands the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the terms of the covenant. And they were inscribed on both sides, front and back, and these stone tablets were God's work. The words on them were written by God himself. And when Joshua, who's with Moses at the time at this mountain, heard the noise that the people were shouting below him, he exclaimed to Moses, 'It sounds like there's a war going on in the camp.' But Moses replied, 'No, it's neither a sound of victory nor a sound of defeat. It is the sound of celebration.' And when they came near the camp, Moses saw the calf and the dancing. And in terrible anger, he threw down the stone tablets to the ground, smashing them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they made, he melted it in the fire. And when the metal had cooled, he ground it into powder and he mixed it into the water and he made the people drink it. And after that, he turned to Aaron. What did the people do to you?" he demanded. "How did you ever make them bring such a terrible sin upon them?" "Don't get upset with me," Aaron replied. "You know how stubborn and what these people, what a wicked bunch they are. And they said to me, 'Make us some gods to lead us, for something has happened to this man Moses who led us out of Egypt.' So I told them, 'Bring me your gold earrings.' And when they brought them to me, I threw them into the fire, and out jumped this calf." And when Moses saw that Aaron had let the people get completely out of control, and much to the amusement of their enemies, he stood at the entrance of the camp and he shouted, "All of you are on the Lord's side. Come over here and join me." And all the Levites came. And he told them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Strap on your swords. Go back and forth from one end of the camp to the other, killing even your brothers, friends, and neighbors." So the Levites obeyed Moses, and about 3,000 people died that day. Welcome to the most messiest story in the whole of this Exodus journey. Aaron turns around to Moses and he says this. If I can have the PowerPoint back on, if it's working. It will work in a minute. But he says this: "I just threw the gold jewelry into the fire, and out jumped this calf." It's a bit of a way of putting it, I suppose, isn't it? It's not the best of excuses that I've ever probably heard in my life. Some excuses, I don't know if you realize, they're more believable than some other excuses that people make, aren't they? But I suppose like all of us, Aaron wouldn't be the first to make a bad excuse, would he? I mean, I think all of us at some time in our life have made a terrible excuse. Whether it's the dog ate my homework, even though you don't own a dog, or there was a power cut during the night, and my alarm didn't go off, when the reality is I pressed the snooze button because it was just a bit more easier. According to Reader's Digest, I'm going to show you some of these, but these are some genuine excuses that some people gave for not showing up to work. I couldn't come into work because I accidentally got onto a plane. I might use that one. That sounds all right. No, I'm sorry. How about this one? Sorry if it's gone ahead of me. It's gone ahead of me. I was experiencing traumatic stress from a large spider I found in our home, and I had to stay at home to deal with it. I can believe that one, actually. Any spider fans out there? Yes, yeah, they're not. I can understand that. My mother-in-law wouldn't stop talking. My mother-in-law, I couldn't get to work because my mother-in-law wouldn't stop talking. Does that sound believable? No. My mother made me my favorite food, and I ate too much. Well, I think this is my best one. I woke up in a good mood, and I didn't want to ruin it. But we all make excuses, and despite how bad as those excuses are, maybe some of the excuses that we've made in our own lives, they don't really match up to Aaron's excuse, is it? There's something about it just sounds just completely unbelievable. And we know the story. We know this excuse isn't true. We know what's happened. We've just read it. We know that Aaron has taken this gold jewelry, the gold jewelry that the Egyptians gifted to the Israelites when they left Egypt, the gold that God gifted to them when they left Egypt. And Aaron has melted this down. He's shaped it, and like the Ark of the Covenant was to be shaped, he's molded it and he's fashioned it around some wood framework, and he's molded it and shaped it into a calf. It's not an accident. It didn't just jump into the fire and then jump out. It's all intention. We know that Aaron's trying to worm himself out of the blame here, that I'm not to blame. It wasn't me. I wasn't responsible. But as bad as his excuse is, maybe Aaron is telling the truth in some sort of way. Maybe there's a bit of a truth to it. Maybe Aaron says something more than what he realizes. Maybe he unknowingly admits, I suppose, to a tendency that all of us, to some degree, have. And that's this, that when times get difficult, when things get uncertain, when life gets a bit hot and things get fiery, there's a tendency to throw our God-given value into those fires, and then our idols jump out. Or to put it another way, in moments of despair, in moments of distress, we easily seek consolation into things that we can touch and things that we can see. So the people of Israel, if we remember this story, they find themselves in a bit of a difficult place. As this passage starts, they haven't seen Moses for 40 days and for 40 nights. He went up to the mountain with no food and no water, and he hasn't come back down. So by all likelihood, I think it's pretty reasonable to some extent. Or by all likelihood, they're either thinking he's either done a runner or he's dead. But one way or another, they strongly believe he's not coming back. And so they panic. Here they are in the wilderness of Sinai, feeling stranded, not just stranded in this wilderness because they've come from Egypt and someone was meant to take us somewhere else, and here we are stuck. They don't just feel stranded in this wilderness, but also spiritually. Because of Moses' absence, they somehow think that God is absent too, that God has ghosted them. And so they begin to seek something and even create something that will lead them and will help them. Now that might seem daft because they've seen some amazing things, haven't they? They've really seen some extraordinary things. They've witnessed God's battle with the gods of Egypt. They have walked through the walls of the sea. They have eaten and they have tasted of this miraculous food of manna in the morning, and have eaten quail that's come out of the sky, and they've drank miraculous water from the rock. They've heard the voice of God, as Tom King mentioned to us a few weeks ago, when he took us through Exodus 19 and 20. And as we saw when Rachel led us the other week in Exodus 24, 70 of their leaders have even eaten at the feet of God in God's presence. I mean, they've seen some amazing things. They've experienced God to some extent. But in the main, Moses has been the living link with God, with Yahweh. And he's gone. And they're understandably worried. I don't know about you, but I would be worried too. Now, I've mentioned this before, but we cannot forget where these people have come from. The God that they have encountered on this journey of the Exodus is not like anything they have ever encountered before. When they lived in Egypt, if you think about what that would have been like with the gods in Egypt, well, they had carvings, they had engravings, they had places where you can go, they had things you could see and touch and you could approach them, and there was priests. But this God, this real God, well, he's not constrained, and he's not captured in those carvings, and he's not captured in engravings. He's a God on the loose. He's a wild God to some extent. You can't stick him in stone. He's invisible. He's undesignable. He's uncontrollable. And they're struggling with this idea of God. They're struggling with this idea and this new experience of God. They're not used to a God that you cannot touch and see and control. This God doesn't meet the heritage that they understand how gods are meant to go about to do their business. And because they're stiff-necked people, and because they're stiff-necked in their thinking about how gods work and how life works, they wrongly interpret Moses' absence to mean that God is also absent. Now we know, of course, that because Moses is absent, that doesn't mean they're separated from God. We know that. We know it very well. But they struggle to imagine a God who can be present if there's not someone to mediate that presence. So inevitably, the people acting on what they have known wrongly go back to what they have known. And we could spend time talking about why they shaped this calf, and Aaron shapes it in the shape of a bull, and how that relates to the gods of Egypt that are some of them a bull-like, and the other cattle-shaped gods that existed around them. But regardless of it, they go back to what they know, and they create something they can see and they can touch. They make a god for themselves. Maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe they're making a god for themselves and departing from worshiping from Yahweh. It could be that they're trying to give a shape to this God, Yahweh, and they're trying to therefore make a false image of this God. But one way or the other, as the first three commandments tell us, as one way or the other, they break the first three commandments. And as a psalmist would put it, they trade in. It's gone back to the beginning. Sorry about this. I wanted the verses to be helpful. They traded the glorious God for a statue of a grass-eating ox. Or as Eugene Peterson translates it, they traded the glory for a cheap piece of sculpture. I mean, that's what they do. Now, I'm not making excuses for these people. What they do is wrong. But I get it. I get it. I can relate to it. I've been there. Maybe you have too. I've been there. There are times when God feels absent. There are times when God has felt unreachable. There's times when I felt abandoned. I can't be the only one. Anyone willing to admit that this morning? 5 of us, 4 of us, 6 of us. The rest of you, your faith is just phenomenal. Can you please come and pray for me later? But it's times when I felt like God is not there. Now, of course, we know God is there. We know it. It's easy to say that when you're not going through those dark nights and those wildernesses and those hard experiences. It's easy to say that. But in the midst of that difficulty, in the midst of our trials, in the midst of, I suppose, those barren seasons in life when nothing seems to come together, well, in the midst of that felt abandonment, well, it's really tempting, isn't it? Is it just me? It's really tempting to construct something new, or to chase after something else, or to make a God of my own, to seek something I can taste and see and touch. It's easy to run back to what I'm used to, and maybe run back to old habits that trap me up. As someone else has said it, when times get hard and God seems nowhere to be found, the consolations in what we can see and touch and taste and smell, well, they're really appealing. They're really appealing. And it's even also tempting when we're adrift from all our certainties and what we know and what we think we knew. It's even tempting to think about God in the wrong way as well and create ourselves a false idea of what God is like. It's important to notice that in this chapter, even before the Israelites make themselves a statue, they already hold to a wrong idea that God has deserted them. They already hold to a false idea of God, even though God hasn't. Even though the manna still turns up every morning, even though the water is still flowing from the rock, they have these false ideas before they make an idol. The ideas themselves are also, in a way, an idol. They have this false image of God. And I've been there too. And then there are times where I'm just honest. There's times when I just rebel. There's times when I feel like I've had enough. When God is not there and I think, God, you're obviously not listening. Well, I'll just run to something more glamorous, more glitzy, and more enjoyable, God. Something that I think will help me get to where I want to go instead of waiting on what God wants for me. Just to be honest, because I think it'll just help us all if we're all a bit honest. See, when the fires of life come, we choose to place our values somewhere, and idols jump out. That's what happens. There's a book written by a Japanese author called 3 Mile an Hour God, written by an author called Kosuke Koyama. And he makes the point that man makes idols because he is lonely. Man makes idols because he's lonely. And he's writing about this scene in Exodus 32. And he notes that the people feel lost. They feel in this precarious situation. They're in this state of alert. They then realize, to some extent, they recognize that they need God, which is a good thing. And he goes on to say that loneliness, well, it can create this moment. It can birth, it's an important opportunity that can birth this moment of, I suppose, a great spiritual realization where our eyes are opened, as we've just sang. A moment where we become more alert to the greatness of God's presence. But the problem is that people don't take that opportunity. They just want a quick fix. They just want a quick remedy. And so they don't grapple with the invisible presence of God. And instead of learning to trust God more and so deepening the realization of the invisible presence of God, they act on their own understanding, their own limited understanding, and they deepen the crisis even more. Now, I'm speaking to myself again here, but maybe it'll help you. But when that sense of loneliness and abandonment comes, it's easy to seek a quick fix, but the hard way forward reckons with a divine presence that, yes, may elude our senses, but it fills us and it animates us with its spirit at the same time. The hard way forward knows absence, I suppose, but it knows something more than that God is still with us, and it chooses to follow anyway. That even in our loneliness, God is with us. That's true, isn't it? 2 people say amen. Even in our loneliness, that's true. God is still with us. Even when I can't sense him, he's still with us. And a hard way forward means reckoning with the sense of God. It may elude my senses. I might not be able to touch it and feel it and taste it, but God is nonetheless real. And what I have to do is trust. I have to wait. That's true of us. That's true of the Israelites. The crazy thing is, we know this story again. The crazy thing, even though this is true, God recognizes, doesn't he, the insecurity of the people. God knows they need something. In fact, he's been planning to meet that need. For the past 7 chapters, as Helen took us through last week, God's been drawing up blueprints for a dwelling place that he would have with the people, where the people could know he is there. God knew their need better than they did. In fact, God knew their need even before they recognized they had this need at all. And he's been planning for it all along. All they needed to do was wait, to trust, to lay aside their timetable and wait on God, which isn't easy, is it? Again, easy to say, but isn't easy. And so in many ways, this golden calf, if you want to think about it this way, it's a cheap knockoff. It's a cheap knockoff. It's a parody of what God was already preparing for them in the tabernacle. God was already making all these plans, but you've made this statue instead. They have this whole thing coming. This elaborately intricate, beautiful designed tabernacle. This priesthood that would help them in all of this. This beautiful thing that God was going to give them, to provide them, to assure them that God's glory and God's presence would actually dwell with them. But instead they build a lifeless statue. A lifeless, deaf, mute and blind statue that can provide no help whatsoever. In fact, it's so useless that as Moses demonstrates it, when he melts down this bull and grinds it, this is no God. You can break it apart, you can cook it, you can eat it, and it will come out in the toilet afterwards. This is no idol. This is no God. If only Moses had been around. If only Moses had been around. None of this would have happened. It would have been all right, wouldn't it? Yeah, you're a bit uncertain, aren't you? If Moses had been around, maybe that's what we wonder, if things would have turned out differently. Moses had been around, maybe the people wouldn't have had this idol whatsoever. Except that's not quite the case. Because Moses' absence exposes something really important. That even before the calf existed, Moses was the idol. That even before the calf existed, Moses was the idol. 3 of you are nodding, but the rest of you are like, in the opening verse, it's gone back again. The opening verse of this passage betrays the thoughts of the people. They gather around Aaron, and they say to Aaron, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Anyone want to spot the mistake in that sentence? Moses did not bring them out of Egypt, did he? See, to state the obvious, Moses didn't do it. Who did it? God did it. And even if Moses doesn't return, like I said, God's power, God's provision, God's presence is no less among them than what it was before. But Moses has become an idol to them. In some sense, he embodies divinity. He is God to some extent in their ideas. In fact, even this problem still carries on beyond Exodus 32. When Jesus was alive, when Jesus walked, Jesus still is alive, but when Jesus walked the earth, he had the same problem, didn't he? When he was talking about himself being the bread from heaven, and he's come to give, the people of Israel turn to him and say, well, Moses gave us bread, our ancestors bread in the wilderness. And Jesus has to turn around and says, I assure you, Moses did not give your bread ancestors in the wilderness. Who did it? The Father did it. So it's as controversial as it may sound. Moses' absence is a necessary thing for the people. It sets up a test for them. They need to learn that Moses is not God. God is God. Moses is not. And it's a test that they fail. But it also sets up a test for Moses. Because while Moses is on top of the mountain, he's having a great time. He's getting these blueprints from God. And God stops the conversation. God sees what is happening at the foot of the mountain in the camp of the Israelites. Please note that. God sees everything that is taking place. He's aware of everything that is happening. He's aware of the golden calf. He's aware of the pagan revelry. He's aware of the false worship. He's aware of everything that's going on. And he lets Moses in on it. And he tells Moses about it. And in the process, God turns to Moses and God says, go down because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. What's going on? Is God doing that parent thing that we all do sometimes? When one of my lads messes up and I turn around to Steph and say, your son. Is that what God is doing? He's not doing that. For starters, God knows as well as Moses does that Moses is not the parent of this nation. He's not even a parent of this situation, these people. They are God's people. Even as early as Exodus 4, God is identified as the sole parent of this nation. He will not share that with anyone else. God made them. God redeemed them. It was God who brought them up out of Egypt. God will not share that glory with anybody else. That's the basis of the first commandment in Exodus 20 in verse 2 to 3. I will not share my glory with anyone else, not even Moses. So God's words aren't saying he's your parent. There's in fact to suggest this, and I just where I get stoned, so please forgive me. But I'm going to suggest that God's word have a satirical, almost a sarcastic tone to them. God knows, just as much as Moses does, that Moses did not bring the people up out of Egypt. But this satire brings to Moses' senses and brings to our awareness this dreadful revelation that in his people's eyes, he has become an idol, symbolizing nothing other than his own self. He has become an idol. And this forms the basis of Moses' test. Because this is a test. Because after this, God gives Moses a proposition. God suggests to Moses that he should just scrap it all. Sack it, I'm done with it. I'm going to take the pages of this story, Moses. I'm going to rip them out of the book of history. I'm going to scrunch them up, and I'm going to toss them into the bin. And then God says to Moses that he's going to eradicate all the people of Israel, these stubborn, stiff-necked people. And you know what, Moses? How about I start afresh with you? And I'll create a new nation just out of you. It's a big offer. If you were in Moses' shoes, what would you do? Because he's not had the easiest time with them, has he? I mean, they've not had the easiest time with him either, but what would you do? What will Moses do? Will Moses consent? Will he get out of God's way and let God's anger blaze? Or will he say no? But if he says no, does that make a difference? Would it change God's plan? Now, admittedly, it's a complex scene. Lots of ink is spilled about trying to describe this conversation between God and Moses. And I need to be clear before I say anything else. In what I'm going to say, I'm not suggesting in any way that God is not angry with the people and the sin of these people. God is, and I'll come back to God's anger. But neither am I questioning Moses' genuine intercession, because intercession is important in the scene. And also, I'm not even going to get into the debate of whether God can actually change his mind or God can have his mind changed. That's a big conversation. Vanny will answer that to you afterwards, after the service this morning, if you go and speak to him. So sorry to disappoint you. But what if there's something else going on in this conversation between God and Moses? What if this is a test of Moses' heart? What if God is wanting to see, for Moses' sake, that Moses has a sense of who God is and who God isn't? That what if this is a test about God getting Moses to wrestle with God's own character? And what if God, in having this conversation with Moses, is not really attempting to pacify his own anger, but rather knowing what Moses is like, because we know what Moses is like, or we should do by now, he's attempting to help Moses with his own anger issues. I'll explain, bear with me. But let's put it this way. Are we willing to accept that God would turn his back on the people he has rescued? Are we willing to accept that God, who wanted to show his greatness in all the nations, through this nation would just wipe them out? Are we willing to accept that God would break his promises? Because if you are willing to believe that, you need to know that Moses isn't not. He's not willing to believe that. Moses gets right into God's face. He pleads with God in this powerful prayer. Moses is fearless. He's bold. He's right in there. He shoves what he has learned about God back into God's face. This is what I know about you. Moses turns around and he says to God, why are you so angry? The Hebrew idiom means, why are your nostrils burning? Why is your nose on fire? That's what it means. Moses is challenging God's reason for being angry in the first place. Don't let your anger burn, is what he's saying to God. Don't let your anger burn. And then Moses makes three powerful appeals to God's own heart about what God is like. Three brilliant answers to three brilliant test questions. Firstly, Moses says to him, I might seem like an idol to my own people, but he doesn't see himself that way. And Moses is clear on who he is and who God is. The people might think they need Moses to have God, but Moses wants nothing to do with that. He throws God's words back at him. Notice this as he responds in verse 11. He throws God's words back at him. He's almost saying, no, these are your people who you brought up out of Egypt. Moses' appeal, not only to God's ownership of the people, but also the history of it. These people are a product of your works, your mighty acts. So it's your responsibility, God. That's what he's saying. It's your responsibility, not mine, to lead them and guide them. It's on you, God. These are your people. And then he jumps into the second defense, and he tells God about his own character, God's own character. He reminds God about what he's like. To paraphrase what Moses is getting at, he's saying this, destroying these people is not the kind of God I know you to be. And neither is it the kind of God that Egypt know you to be. You are the God of the Hebrews, Moses appears to say. The God who is famous for rescue. And killing these people won't make you famous. Instead, it will make you infamous. You won't look like the good guy. You'll look like the villain. If you do this, if you can't lead your own people, Lord, you will look worse than Pharaoh. The people will say you just brought them out into the desert to wipe them out. That's not your character, God. And then thirdly, Moses reminds God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because God had promised, had he not, to make a descendant out of their descendants. A nation out of their descendants. A numerous nation that would be a blessing to all nations. Now, I've read a number of people suggest that if God had started again with Moses, he would still be keeping to his promise, because Moses, after all, is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Moses would not agree with you. Moses would not agree with you. Back in Genesis 46, verse 4, And I'm not expecting you to remember, but I quoted this verse the very first week of this series. But God promised to Jacob, Israel, that he would go down into Egypt with Jacob, and he would bring Jacob back out of Egypt into the promised land. Did he or did he not? In the same sentence, in the same breath, God also told Jacob he would die in Egypt. It's not a contradiction. God knows Jacob, the person, will die in Egypt, but Jacob, the nation, the Israelites, won't. That God has promised to bring Jacob's family, the whole nation, out of Egypt. And Moses knows that he's not the whole nation. He's just a fragment of it. And so, Lord, if you wipe those people out, you break your promise. And I know you are not a promise-breaking God. And I don't know about you, but I think they're great answers. God's history, God's name, God's promises. Moses slams all of these three things back at God. He knows what God is like. He knows what God is not like. And regardless of how we understand the mechanics of how this happens, it works. God relents. Verse 14 tells us, the Lord relented and did not bring the people the disaster he had threatened. Read that verse again. The Lord relented and he did not bring to the people the disaster he had threatened. I think that's an important verse. Please, that's an important verse. Understand it. Read it. Don't forget it. Again, I'm not going to get into the idea if God's mind can be changed. But don't forget this verse. It's crucial because Moses in prayer has rightly presented to God what God is like. He has shown he understands God's character. And so you'd also think now, because he has explained God's heart perfectly, you would think that Moses would be able to display God's heart perfectly too. But to put it another way, will God now show and put forward the mercy that God has chosen to show? I can see some of you like, I don't know if you've never noticed this, but you can pray some great prayers for people. It's easy, isn't it, to some extent? In the presence of God, I'll be honest with you, I can pray for people really well. I can intercede for people really well. Even if people get on my nerves, I can pray for them in the presence of God. I can pray for them really, really, really well. But when the rubber hits the road and I actually encounter those people, things can go horribly wrong. How many of us are great at praying for others in God's presence and loving others in God's presence? And how many of us, when it comes to the real thing, struggle? It's like the difference between a driving theory test and a driving practical test. Yeah? Put it that way. I passed with flying colors on my theory test. Amazing. In the classroom, I'm a 10 out of 10. Not a problem at all. Just like Moses, he's been in the classroom with God on top of the mountain. He's 10 out of 10. He's passed the test. He's done the work. Tick, tick, tick. Well done, Moses. But it took me 5 times to pass my practical test. Because on the road, it's different. And as for Moses, well, let's say he makes more than a few minor faults. Because as great as Moses is on the mountain, as great as Moses is able to recognize his anger, he's recognized God's anger, and he can deal with God's anger, but then Moses starts to descend, and I like the way it says that. We know he's moving physically down the mountain, but it says he turns, that's an important phrase, he turns away from the presence of God, and he moves down. An important thing. And even though God has already told Moses what is happening, and even though God knows what is happening, even though God has just relented from his own anger, knowing what is happening, ergo, God will not act on what he has seen. When Moses sees for himself what is happening, all his fear and his test answers go out of the window. His anger flares up, we are told in verse 19. His nostrils grow hot. And in his anger, he loses control. He throws the stone tablets to the ground. He smashes God's covenant with the people. He's not instructed to do that. He does it. And then he proceeds to destroy the gold calf and feed it to the people. And maybe those two actions have some sense to them. But they fail to pacify his anger. He's still angry even after doing those things. Even Aaron's words to Moses in verse 22 are the same words. They might be translated differently, but are the same words Moses has just expressed to God on the top of the mountain. Aaron turns to Moses and says, "Don't let your anger burn." But does Moses hear Aaron like God heard Moses? No. He closes his ears. He closes his hearing. He just sees, and he lets what he sees feeds his anger even more. And so he goes further, and he instigates a slaughter, and as a result, 3,000 people die. I read someone say that in light of the millions of Israelites that existed, 3,000 people is not a huge percentage. I don't care about percentages. 3,000 people is an awfully lot of people. I can't even say it right. It's an awful lot of people. Tremendous. Now, time doesn't allow, but this slaughter raises lots of questions. It does for me. When I read this closely, it does for me. Like, what were the Levites doing before all of this? Weren't all the people involved in this act? Weren't all the people involved? Were they not involved? And does it not seem odd that Team Moses in this scene happens to be the same tribe that Moses is part of? Think about it. There's a systematic killing of every other tribe in Israel apart from Levi. They get immunity. They can't all have been innocent, can they? I mean, we know one Levite that definitely wasn't innocent, at least, don't we? And that is, well, not just, well, I mean, in the scene of the calf, we know one Levite that was not innocent. And it's Aaron. And yet Aaron gets immunity. He's not involved in this. He gets a free pass. I don't think that means Moses believes his excuse about the calf, but Moses gives him immunity. There's something else going on right here. Also, as an aside, and this is an interesting aside, so I don't normally do this, but in Acts chapter 2, we have the day of Pentecost, which is all just a retelling of this story of the law at Sinai. That's what Pentecost marks. This moment when the people received the law. Except on Pentecost, we received the Spirit. And Peter gets up and he starts preaching at Pentecost, doesn't he? And he talks about the merciful provision of God and what God has given to us in Christ Jesus. And the writer of Acts tells us that 3,000 people were added to the people of God that day. There's a connection between those stories. It's a reverse of what happens in this disaster. When God puts his mercy forward, people are added. They're not subtracted, people are added. I'll let you explore that a bit more. But back to this story, it's a horrible scene. It's an absolute disaster. We can be honest about that. You should be honest about that. And even though, and I need to spell this out, even though Moses in verse 27 claims, this is what the Lord says, go about, strap on your swords, etc., etc., we know, because we've just read the story. We've just listened to the conversation. We've just seen it through. We know that that is not what the Lord said. We know that God's decision, already knowing what the people were doing and already seeing everything that has happened. God's had no extra data given to him. He's already made his decision, but Moses hasn't done it. So Moses can calm God, apparently, but he can't calm his own self. I know a few people like that. No one in this room, don't worry. I know some people like that. Moses does what he desperately implored God not to do. Moses does what he said would be against God's own character and God's own glory. I'm saying that because we often focus on the gross error of Aaron and the people in the story. It is a gross error. But Moses has made the same mistake as Aaron and the people. Moses, too, in a way, has encountered a fiery situation. And out of that fiery situation jumps an idol, a false image of God's glory. And maybe we don't see it. Maybe we don't want to admit to it in the story because maybe we too, like the people, have got our own idolatry view of Moses. But Moses fails. He makes a mistake. Now I want to be clear here, so please give me a time. I know you've listened very well, but please give me a time. The question is not whether God is angry at the golden calf or if he's not. Of course God is angry. There's a pain in the heart of God over this act. It's a sinful act. God has every right to be upset. It's like someone has cheated on him on the wedding night. We'll come to that in a few weeks. He doesn't treat sin lightly. God does not treat sin lightly. Ultimately, we know Christ suffers to break the power of sin and to break that power in our lives. God does not just ignore it. The question is, what does God do in his anger, and what does Moses do in his anger? See, when we think about the anger of God, one of the best treatments I've ever read about it is by a guy called Abraham Joshua Heschel in a book that he wrote called The Prophets. And he notes that in our modern understanding of anger, We often have these ideas about it being spiteful and reckless, and it's about iniquity, it's wrong. And we think of anger as a possessive, overtaking emotional action. And the reason we think of it that way is because we often allow our anger to overtake us and we let it to control us. But as Heschel points out, God's anger does not control God. God controls it. That's a big difference between God and people. God controls his anger. Even in this story, God is angry, but he doesn't act in an unrestrained way. In fact, he sits down Moses and he has a conversation about how he feels. How many people did that the last time they were angry? He sits down with Moses and he has a conversation about his feelings. He lets his views be examined. It's almost like he lets his divine will become vulnerable to human challenge. He lets his anger be challenged. See, God's anger is not reckless. It's not spiteful. Now, that doesn't mean God's anger is a false feeling, like God's faking it. It isn't. As Heschel states, God's anger is lamentation. It's all the voices of the prophets. They express the same thing. God is angry because God is not indifferent to evil. God is concerned. God is affected in his love for us by what humanity does to each other. Even in the Hebrew prophets, God's anger is not treated like some emotional outburst or an irrational fit or a tantrum, but it's part of his continual care and his sympathy for us. He wants us to be moved by what happens. See, unlike the humanity that God often has to challenge in the Bible, God's heart is not a heart of stone. It's a heart of flesh. He feels and he's moved. I don't know about you, but personally, I hope God is angry at what is happening in Gaza and the Ukraine and the Sudan. I hope God is angry at our inhumanity to each other. I hope God is angry at poverty. I hope God is angry at rape. I hope God is angry at child molestation. I hope God is angry. If God is not angry, my prayers are just a waste of time. But God gets angry. His nostrils grow hot. But that does not mean that God isn't angry. God. To say God isn't angry, God is something else. The prophets never speak about God that way. In fact, they often describe God as having large nostrils. Or as we've sang it this morning, God is slow to anger. He is slow to anger, and God will reveal that to Moses in Exodus 34. He'll reveal it again to Moses, I am slow to anger. Now, in the ancient world, the gods, the other false gods, are often seen as spiteful, malicious. Anger was who they are. It was just a natural disposition, but not this God. This God is often described as not being like that. His anger passes. It's short. Again and again, we are told in the scriptures that God's love and kindness go on forever and ever and ever. But we are never told that his anger goes on forever. Anger is always described as a moment for God. It's never a feeling that he abides in. And moreover, in the Hebrew text, anger is not even an emotion that God delights in unleashing. He does not like unleashing his anger. In fact, he deplores it. On several occasions, he says to the people, why are you doing this to me? Why are you bringing this onto yourself? There's a sense that God finds it distasteful. In fact, the only thing God delights in, because he's never described as delighting in anger, in fact, God delights in kindness and justice and righteousness. Is this grasping? But God's anger, God's pain is important, as Heschel points out, because it's a reminder to us that mankind is in need of forgiveness. We need to hear how God feels. Otherwise, we think everything's all right. It's a reminder that the world is dark and it's in need of light. It's a summons to us to become aware of the agony and the pain and the conflicts and the frustrations and the sin that exists, not just in the world, but even right down the middle of my own self. God wants me to have a heart of flesh, just like he has a heart of flesh. He wants us to be moved like he is moved. Does that make sense? And God's response to his anger, well, it's not like Moses's, but God's response in his anger is to repair and to restore what is out of joint and what is broken. See, God pursues in the Old Testament, and in the New, he pleads. He goes to all lengths to restore people. As the Methodist minister William Lofthouse put it, he said it this way: God will and can never rest until the defaulter is brought not to punishment, but to re-entrance into the old relationship. That's what God wants. Restored relationship. And that's what we see in the golden calf story too. In this disastrous interruption to God's plans. Because I need you to know that the story does not end in chapter 32. You might read the last 3 verses of chapter 32, but it doesn't stop there. This story continues into 33 and to 34. It's the same story as Moses once again seeks the forgiveness of God. And without stepping on the toes of what will come next week, the conclusion to this horrible episode is not that God destroys Israel, but God forgives. He forgives their sin and he renews the covenant. Do we grasp that? The stones Moses broke, God says, you better make me some new ones, pal, and let's write this out again. Let's go again. And as part of that big revelation as Moses is in the cleft of that rock, he's given this wonderful description of God, and God primarily characterizes himself once again as a God who is full of grace and who is full of mercy, whose nostrils are large. Not like yours, Moses, but mine are large. See, Moses does not do what God does in his anger. God seeks to restore. Moses fails. And I'm going to say that because it's not the first time Moses fails. We all know the famous story in Numbers 20 with striking the rock. And we think sometimes God's impatient because he writes Moses off for that one offense. He's not writing Moses off for one offense. Throughout his career as leading, he has often failed to show the otherness of God to the people. That's Moses' failure. And I'm not getting at Moses, but as great as he is, he's still human like you and me. And his failing isn't just his failing, is it? Humanity as a whole, who is made to be God's image, has failed to display the otherness of God. I fail at that. Does anyone not fail at that? See, in the story of history, only one man has ever succeeded at doing that. And that's Jesus. Jesus. God, who came among us, doing what we could not do, showing us the otherness of God. As John writes in the opening of his gospel, the Word became human and lived on earth among us, dwelled among us, as Helen read that verse to us last week. But he goes on to say he was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, grace and truth, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son of the Father. Moses doesn't show the glory of God, Christ does. So even on the cross, we see this glory and this faithfulness and this unfailing love. As Jesus suffers, as he's wounded, as he's insulted, as he's executed by humanity, as we are doing our idolatry and not treating God as he ought to be treated, we see this horrible scene, but we witness the light of God as well, absorbing our sin, pleading with us, issuing forgiveness in return of every blow. We fail, but God reaches out. We crucify God, but God, in the midst of our idolatry, acts to bring about a way for that relationship to be restored. We fail, God fixes things. That is the gospel, isn't it, in a nutshell? It's got to be. It can't be me fixing things. See, and unlike Moses' response, God's anger leads to the giving of himself. And unlike Moses, but I don't know if you've realized this, but unlike Moses, Jesus gives us a better meal to eat. That God doesn't grind down our mistakes and our sins and failures. He doesn't rub it in our faces, does he? He doesn't force us to drink our failings and our problems. Actually, he gives us himself. Symbolized in this bread and this juice that we'll drink in a moment. And he gives us that not to remember our great failings, although yes, we have great failings and we have great sin, but to lean on his great grace, his mercy, and his forgiveness. Can we see that this is a better meal to eat than some ground-up statue? And so when those times come and we struggle to sense that God is with us, we sense the struggle at forgiveness, when the guilt on us feels heavy and we feel that God is unreachable and absent, well, we can come and we can take and we can eat and we can know that God is with us.